Hello, wizards, witches, and everyone in between. My name is Emma, and today I will be doing another common room discussion video on classics. Alright, so we're keeping it casual again in this common room video. If you haven't watched my previous one, I will link it down below, but basically this series, I guess, is just me posing a question, giving my thoughts on it, and then you guys answer it in the comments and we can have a little chat. So today I'm coming at you from my bedroom floor. So this is the bottom of my bookcase that I usually don't show, but here we are. And it's freaking hot today. It is 95 degrees in April. So today I have water instead of my tea from last time, and I'm just trying not to melt, okay? Classics. This is such an interesting topic because I feel like some people are very pro-classics and some people are very anti-classics, and then there's people in the middle. My overall question for this video is, do you need to read classics to be a well-read person, or to consider yourself a well-read person? And before I give my thoughts on that specific question, I just want to talk about classics for a second. I've seen on BookTube and like Book Twitter some hesitation about picking up classics, and I'm assuming it's because of bad required reading experiences in high school that leads people to be like, I'm never picking up a classic again. Then you have people who are like, can come off kind of snobby about classics. And to be honest, I have not seen anyone on BookTube or on Book Twitter coming off as snobby about classics, but I've heard people in bookstores, I know people in real life that are like that, so I'm not like trying to shade anybody. So here's my take on classics. I will be doing a video on the classics that I have read and the classics that I want to read, and if I'd reread the ones I've already read, etc. So that's a whole nother video, but for me, I've read some classics that I liked, and I've read some classics that I did not like. So I completely understand when people want to avoid classics because they read a couple in high school and hated them, and so they like don't want to pick one up because they're scared of not liking it. And I know for myself, if I'm trying to like push myself to read something that I'm not loving, then I can put myself in a slump, and I don't think any of us want that. But here's my opinion on it. Do I think you need to read classics in order to be considered a well-read person? No. And I think that because everyone, like, books are so subjective. Our opinions on books, the books we pick up, the genres that we like, it's all personal to us. So what I would consider myself to be well-read, like the books that I would read and be like, wow, I feel well-read, are different than someone else's books that they have been wanting to pick up and feel like that would broaden their book horizons, make them feel more well-read. And not to say that people have to feel that way or that you have to read a bunch of things, that's what people usually say as a way to get people to read classics, is like, well, it'll make you more well-read. In general, I do think that people who say, I'm not reading any classics because I read this in high school and I hated it, I feel like they're doing themselves a disservice, and here's why. There are many classics out there. There's children's classics, there's adult classics, and I feel like there's like a common group of 5 or 10 that most everyone has had to read in high school, at least in the United States, and they're very dense. And so people are subjected to these handful of classics, and if you didn't enjoy all of them, then you might be like, classics aren't for me. But here's the thing, classics are across all genres, and that's a whole nother discussion of like, how do you what constitutes a book to be considered a classic. I feel like by cutting yourself off of classics, you're cutting yourself off from just a wide range of books. Not all classics are I think what we have this negative connotation of is being like stuffy and slow with, you know, difficult writing and just a plot we can't connect with. I feel like I want to like shake people by the shoulders and be like, not all classics are like the ones that you were forced to read in high school and hated. Also, I have read some in high school that I did not like at the time, and I reread them later and I liked them. And I think this is because of the whole concept of like required reading. You have to read it whether you feel like it or not, and then you just go to class and discuss the living shit out of it and write essays, and it's like sometimes you just want to read something and then be done with it, you know? And so I feel like in general, most things that I've read in class, even if I really liked it, I always like it more upon rereading it, because I don't have to do a bunch of assignments with it. I can just read it and put it away and be like, that was nice. So I think sometimes people are anti-classics because they don't like the writing. For me, personally, not to like give away my next video talking about the classics I've read, but I have read some, such as Wuthering Heights is one that I've read, and there are others like that that were written in the same century as that are dense. And I think people get caught up in the writing style and feel that it's too difficult to read, which is fair. But I also think when we're rereading or when we're reading things not for a class, right, we can go at our own pace. Some classics I've read since high school, I read slowly. I read them like throughout the month. I read a little bit every day because they are dense. And that's just the way things were written back then. And I'm not gonna sit here and not read classics just because they aren't written for me in 2019. I also think audiobooks are a great way to go, especially if you like paired an audiobook, like listened to it and physically read along with the audiobook at the same time. I think that might help. But what it really comes down to for me is people are missing out on these stories. So for example, in high school, I read The Awakening by Kate Chopin, and I loved it. It's like a feminist story of a woman who learns that she deserves more and wants more out of her life than what society is telling her she should be doing. And I don't care when those kinds of books were written, I'm here for that. So I loved it. But one of my best friends who was in this class with me, she hated the writing, like really hated it. And then I was talking to her a couple years ago and she was saying how in like upon reflecting on that story, she really liked the plot, but she just couldn't handle the way that it was written, which is fair because there's a lot of like unnecessary passages where it's just like, okay, let's get to like the good stuff. But that can be said also with any book written now or 100 years ago or 200 years ago. There are still really great stories out there that if you can just get through the writing style, knowing the story, it's worth knowing the story. There's also a website called Shmoop. I utilized this a lot in high school, and it's basically like SparkNotes but more in depth and also very funny, where they review like chapter by chapter a summary of what happened, looking at the big themes of the story, the metaphors in the story, the character analysis. Like, it's a great website, and so I would read a chapter and then read the chapter summary on there just to make sure I'm getting the story. It all comes down to the storylines. I don't care who it was written for or when it was written. If I like the story and the story sounds interesting to me, then you should read it. So I think kind of the idea I'm trying to get at here is if you took like 20 classics, like those classic books that are always referenced that if you've never read them, if someone wrote like a 2-sentence summary of the book, dropped it in a hat, scrambled it around, and you went and picked out like your top 5 favorite plot lines that sounded interesting that you feel like you'd like to read about, then read them. Read those classics. Read the classics that interest you, not the ones that you feel pressured to read. It reminds me of people who don't watch black and white movies, which again, I feel like even more so, I feel like they're doing themselves a disservice. Like, is color really that important? Like, do you have to know if that lady's jacket is red or if it's pink in order for you to enjoy the story? Because there's so many good black and white films out there, and I know so many people who refuse to watch them because they're boring. And I'm like, you have the writing, you have the acting, you have the cinematography, you have the costumes, you have the set design, all of this stuff that can be great because you're here to watch the story unfold, and you are caught up on the fact that it's not in color. It blows my mind. I do not understand that at all. But that, it kind of reminds me of this thing of like, well, I might not be able to fly through this book because it was written in the 1800s or the 1900s, therefore I'm not gonna read it. And that just, it irks me. And so I think that's another reason maybe to read more classics, is because I feel like for the most part classics are classics for a reason, and just because they aren't your cup of tea and the plot line isn't your cup of tea, and whatever reason they're a classic for isn't your cup of tea, whether it's the time period it was written or the author or the plot or the political commentary, whatever it is that makes it a classic, just because that doesn't interest you doesn't make it not worthy of being a classic. Because I think that's another thing, is a lot of these classics are so old that we need to take into account when they were written. That's, to me, that's very important. And keeping in mind, like, to go back to the whole thing of like people getting upset with like a slower writing style or using like old English words that we don't use anymore, that's when it was written. That's how people talked back then. And it's just because it's not how we talk now doesn't mean it's like incomprehensible and something that should prevent us from kind of deciphering what's happening and reading the book. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think about classics down below. If you have a favorite classic, let me know. Have you ever felt pressured to read a classic? Do you have to read them to be considered a well-read person? I hope you guys are all doing well, and I will talk to you later.